late afternoon session. Thank you for joining. So the next 40-ish minutes or so, I'm going to speak about flow and predictability in organizations. And I do have a simple message for you. So let's start with that. And that is that I urge you to get the elephant off the road. My name is Joakim von Prónay. I usually say that I'm an engineer and psychologist by education, coach by passion, and curious by nature. I work as a consultant, more specifically an organization and leadership coach. And I have been working in a coaching capacity in technology organizations now for more than a decade. And when you prepare for presentations, it's always good to start with a quote, early on at least. So I have one as well. And I usually say it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And part of the message here is also that in organizations, if you focus on team flow, you will enable enterprise predictability. So who in here also listened to Vasco's talk earlier? A few hands, okay. So I'm saying essentially the same thing, but in a very different way. So I'm hoping I'm contributing to meaningfully different conversations on the same topic, roughly. And in the last 10 years or so, working as a coach in organizations, I commonly see 3 problems recurring. And the first one of these problems is strategy, question mark. Essentially, you go into an organization and you start asking, what are you trying to do and why are you trying to do that? And when you pose those questions to the organization, very often I'm met with no answers. More often than that, I'm met with very different answers. And that is even more troublesome. And commonly, if you go to the engineering teams and the development teams to ask, what are you doing and why are you doing that? You are usually met with answers in the sounding something like, well, we were simply told to do this, that's why we're doing it. And it's also important to do this because there's a deadline. Okay, sounds like a good strategy. The second problem I commonly see is that of the roadmap, or mainly the roadmap as the primary artifact, or even worse, the only artifact that is treated with any type of importance in the organization. So they use the roadmap for everything, essentially. You use it for stakeholder management, you use it for stakeholder communication, you use it for decision making, and more dreadfully, you use it to communicate that deadline. And the third common problem I see is that however the organization measures capacity or capability to deliver things, as seen on the roadmap, that is usually planned to more than 100%. Very often it's planned to 120, 125%, right? Because if you aim for the stars, at least you might hit the moon, right? And what happens? What happens when you have essentially all 3 of these problems, or perhaps even only one of them? And more from the point of view of that roadmap, right? That is so important. And to paint that picture, let's try to look at a road. And what we're interested in here is, of course, the throughput of the road. And the throughput of the road is decided by the number of lanes we have and the speed limit. And as we can clearly see here, we have a road with 2 lanes going in the same direction. It is 100 kilometers long, and it has a speed limit of 50 kilometers an hour. That's quite clear. Now, on this road, we have traffic. We have cars on the road. And if we then assume a car length of 5 meters, which is quite a large car, but nonetheless, we can have, at any one point in time, we can have 40,000 cars on this road. Because they all fit. And if they all travel at the speed limit of 50 kilometers an hour, they individually need 2 hours of travel time to travel this stretch of road, or cycle time. And that gives us a throughput of 20,000 cars per hour. Right? At least it gives us a theoretical maximum throughput of 20,000 cars per hour. But what happens when you have 100% utilization of road surface? Who here has been in a traffic congestion? I certainly have. So at 100% utilization of road surface, the speed of travel goes towards zero. We are not going anywhere because we are essentially stuck in traffic. That's why we call it stuck in traffic. But for the sake of this example, let's assume that we can at least travel 5 kilometers an hour. At a leisurely walking pace, we're at least moving forward. So that gives each car a cycle time or travel time of 20 hours instead, and thus giving us a throughput for this road of 2,000 cars per hour. So far, quite simple math. Now, that is of course not good enough. 2,000 is nowhere near the theoretical maximum of 20,000. So we want to improve that, right? We want to increase the throughput. And essentially, you have two strategies to do this. The first one being you can of course reduce demand. Reduce demand for road surface. So we can simply put a traffic light at the beginning of the road, and we can turn the light red, and we can say no more cars are allowed to enter. Perfectly fine. We have reduced the demand for road surface. And what happens when you do this? Well, it will self-regulate. Some cars will finish their journey. The distance between the cars behind will start to increase. They will begin to speed up, and everything will start to move along. Now, you will reach an interesting threshold here, and that threshold is how many cars can we allow on the road simultaneously so all of them can travel at the speed limit. And now, for all the mathematicians in here, that is an optimization problem. If you have all the parameters and all the data, you can easily calculate that and say X. But in reality, and especially in a roadmap, we don't have all the data, and we have inherent variability. So we don't have all of these parameters. We cannot observe the whole system at once. So you need to experiment to find this balance. You need to have an experiential approach where you gradually increase the amount of vehicles on the road to see at what point do they begin to slow down. And if we take the numbers that we have here in our example, we can turn it the other way around, and we can say at a utilization rate of 10% of road surface, essentially we have 4,000 cars on the road, we still get the same throughput, with the added benefit that their travel time is reduced to 1/10 of that of the fully utilized road. So that is one of the approaches that you can use. You reduce demand, and then you start to see increased flow. The other approach is that you can increase capacity. Right? Sounds reasonable. And a common misconception when I work in organizations here is when organizations want to increase their capacity, they usually mean that they want to increase overall throughput by means of increasing the speed. We want to do things faster. So here, let's do that. Let's double the speed limit. If we can drive 100 kilometers an hour, we can essentially drive, 100 kilometers in an hour. So we have doubled the throughput, right? Well, we still have cars on the road, and we're still congested. And at 100% utilization of road surface, speed still goes towards zero. So it doesn't matter if a manager has told you that you're allowed to drive 100, because you simply can't. There is a car in front of you. Now, if we want to, so the other parameter that we have to play with when we talk about increasing capacity of the road, or essentially improving throughput or flow, is we can increase the number of cars we have on the road at the same time. That's essentially the other parameter. And here in our two-lane road, there is no more room for cars, so we can't do that. If we want to do that, we need to invest. We need to invest in infrastructure. Perhaps we need to lay new asphalt, we need to install safety railing, perhaps physical lane separation, wider shoulders, maybe we want to add a third lane. All very reasonable examples. All of these examples, however, requires construction. We certainly need to shut down part of the road to allow for this construction. And during this time where we do the construction work, our overall throughput and our overall capacity on this road is of course reduced. One whole lane is shut off to allow for the construction vehicles, and for the safety of everyone involved and even the cars traveling on the road, we need to reduce the speed limit even further, thus lowering overall speed and overall throughput even more. And in organizations, when you say this, if you want us to go faster, we essentially have told you for decades, we need to go slow first to go fast later. Well, that's not an option. We need to go fast now, preferably yesterday. Okay, how much can we spend and invest on infrastructure and improve the overall delivery capability? Well, of course, nothing. You just have to run faster. But regardless here, so regardless if you manage to convince that you're allowed to reduce demand or if you get some budget to invest, there's one thing in common in both of these scenarios. And I assume you all spotted it because it's the traffic light. In both scenarios, you still need to regulate the incoming traffic. And in terms of software development or organizations in general dealing with complexity, the traffic light is not really a traffic light. It's more like a diverging of traffic to do some sort of justification or classification. I commonly talk about it as the request intake process or the request in funnel or the idea process, or essentially how ideas in your organization end up being implemented as software in the end. What does that process look like? And that is essentially the concept of the traffic light. And fundamentally, I've heard other people say this in the management track sessions today as well, it is a way to systematically say no to things. You must say no to things. And here, this is, and the main question that you need to answer here, when this little gray blob reaches the little blue area, the main question you need to ask is it valuable enough for us to allow this thing on the road in the first place? And you must answer that question before you know whether it's a vehicle or not. That's the really hard part. And so imagine you and your team, you are essentially responsible for the safe and the flow of traffic on the road. So roadworthiness of vehicles, that is what you're responsible for. And someone comes to you in your garage and they bring this big thing along. It's covered by a big blanket or underneath a canvas. You can't see what it is. And this person asks, when can this thing be done with the journey? That is a trick question. Don't answer that question. You need to turn the conversation around and come to an agreement where both parties say, it is valuable enough for us to allow this thing to begin the journey. Cool. And by now, you've all read the 8 bullets as well, and that is just one example. It's the opportunity canvas by Jeff Patton. It's a good example to structure such conversations. There are many tools like it, and this is a good starting point. So let's assume you had that conversation. The answer is yes. Yes, it is valuable for us to allow this thing on the road. What happens then? Do we just put it on the road? No, not yet. It moves into the next stage. And here, the next step, I commonly call the team estimation process. Deliberate and somewhat unfortunate use of the word estimation here, also to spark some thoughts. Because the whole point of the estimation process is that we need to shift the focus of this process to produce uniform pieces of work instead of creating an estimate. And now, when dealing with complex problems, you will achieve that by involving most of the engineering team in most of the discussions surrounding the thing that you're trying to realize. And when you have, within this estimation process, if your focus is to create uniform pieces of work, your goal is to achieve sustainable and predictable delivery on team level first. Now, if we take the example of the big thing coming along, we don't know what it is. When can this thing be done with its travel? Let's assume you're being pushed to give an answer. Let's say, yeah, it can be done by Thursday. Perfect. I'll put that in the roadmap. Excellent. So then you're usually held accountable to what is essentially a guess, based on usually very poor understanding of what it is, or at least very poor understanding of the roadworthiness of what is hopefully a vehicle. And instead, so if you shift focus of this process to create uniform pieces of work, you will be able to, instead of being held accountable towards a guess, you will be able to prioritize based on potential outcome and business value. That's the whole point. I almost meant to do that. And when in my experience as well, I haven't been in an organization in the last 10 years or so with only one team. So it's always been multiple teams. And then you're very likely to have multiple of these team estimation processes running in parallel, all of them contributing to traffic on the road. And in my experience, so here are 3 points. Good practices and guidelines to understand how to start and whether or not you have a well-functioning process. And number 1 is essentially have at least 2 hours of recurring backlog refinement with the whole team every week. And this can be backlog refinement, backlog grooming, pre-planning, whatever you call it. The crucial part is that it is a structured and organized session where you talk about the upcoming work. That's the point. And you need to have structured and organized session that you don't skip, because they are crucial to understand and to make sure that the vehicles are roadworthy. The second part to this, utilize a definition of ready. Essentially, a checklist you have before you're actually allowed to plan and bring work into the sprint or into the iteration. Have a checklist. Essentially, go through the checklist to make sure that the vehicles are roadworthy and safe. In Sweden, we would call it that, the besiktning. In Germany, it will be the TÜV. In English, I don't know if they have a single word for it, but essentially, make sure that the vehicle is roadworthy. Does it have 4 wheels? Does it have good air pressure? Does it have a windscreen? All of those things. And on this list, good to have is, of course, the definition of done. What does it mean when this functionality, this feature, this whatever we're developing, what does it look like when it's done? Crucially connected to that, how do we demo? How do we show that this thing actually solves the problem intended? Have that conversation early on. Know how you're going to demonstrate it before you actually start. And on top of that, any other questions that you find yourselves regularly asking, just ask them early on. You might not have the answers before you start, but ask the questions and don't be surprised that you have to find such answers along the way. Now, an interesting indicator here, whether or not this process is actually working, is when the team, and I say when here, when the team does not have enough time to finish their conversations in those 2 hours that you have organized and structured, they will simply book a session themselves and continue. Or they will continue immediately afterwards in front of a whiteboard, and they will clarify any outstanding questions they have as a team. If they still have unanswered questions after that, they will go directly to the requester or the stakeholder and ask. The magic difference here is that they will do this on their own. You, as their engineering manager, product manager, scrum master, agile coach, whoever is supporting the team, you don't have to do it for them. If we listen to Jacob and Gidde's talk, this is team accountability. If they feel empowered to make decisions, they will take the responsibility of clarifying such questions on their own. Now, last point might also be a bit controversial here. I say that when you have a well-functioning process, planning should not take more than 15 minutes per week you are planning. So if you're planning a 2-week sprint or a 2-week iteration, it should take you no more than 30 minutes to plan. And this will be a leading indicator to whether or not you have well-refined stories or work items that you bring into your plan. Essentially, this will be a leading indicator to whether or not the vehicles you allow on the road are actually cars. Hingent on the fact that you actually do the things you plan, of course. We can all hastily plan something for less than 15 minutes per week. We are planning and then not deliver any of that, of course. So that is yeah, usually if you feel like you don't have to say anything, you usually have to say it. So yes, a good functioning process means that the team actually deliver the things as well. And when you get to a point where you have multiple teams that have well-functioning processes, they do take responsibility for the roadworthiness of the vehicles that they let through their process. And what happens when you only have cars on the road? So this will be a point where you have good predictability, low variability on the work items on team level, and it's essentially working quite well. So what we see here above the timeline, the 2 blue dots, let's call them epics. The first one has been through the team estimation process enough times so the team can predictably say that this is 5 cars or this is 5 work items for us. And alongside, when you do this and when you establish a well-functioning process, you will also establish a good delivery capability of the team. And if this team, as an example, if they can do 3 things per sprint or 3 things per iteration, they can predictably say that if we are allowed to focus on this thing alone and no other items of higher priority emerge, we will most certainly do this in 2 sprints or 2 iterations. Now, crucially, that will be the most accurate forecast based on actual data that the team can provide. And no estimate will consistently outperform that in terms of accuracy. You can use this for enterprise forecasting. You can simply take a step back and you can use the historical average upward in the work item hierarchy. If we take the same team and their blue epics, one of them is 5 work items, the other is 7. We can use the historical average of 6 and we can use that number and that team's capability to deliver over time. We can use that for enterprise level forecasting. And now I hope the mathematicians out there are many warning flags going off now. Hopefully. Because it's true, this will absolutely not be mathematically accurate. You do not have that precise data. But for the purpose of enterprise level forecasting and enterprise level decision making on portfolio level, it will absolutely be good enough. Absolutely. And once more, no estimate will consistently outperform this. And if this is one of the topics that I'm working with in an organization, when I get to this point of establishing an overall concept and the principles behind this and bringing it into the corporate lingo so we talk roughly about the same things. Yeah, I get it. I understand, I see what you're trying to say, but this will of course not work here. That is almost exclusively the experience I have. And here, 3 of the common excuses that I hear for why it won't work will now follow. And funnily enough, they're also essentially the reasons for the 3 aforementioned problems, which I find quite interesting. The first one being all our things are important. We have way too many important things. We can absolutely not say no to things. The traffic light concept, yeah, sounds good. cannot do it, will not work. So who in here is currently or have been in an organization with multiple priority 1? Multiple priority 0? Yeah, so that's a symptom as a reaction to an organization's inability to actually address and have the tough conversations and actually make decisions. And the question that I try to infuse into the organization here is, what is actually our priority? What is it that we're trying to do, and why is that important? And in terms of our road, if all the cars on the road are emergency response vehicles, all with their blue lights on, responding to an emergency, who is going to get out of the way for the fire truck? Second excuse or second reason I hear is that, well, the deadlines we have on our roadmap, they're fixed. Very important. And here, as I said in the beginning, the problem here is that organizations sometimes tend to use the roadmap for everything. And I say a roadmap can't do everything for you. And it shouldn't. There need to be a separation of responsibility of the artifacts that you're using in your organization. They need to be purposeful and purpose-built. And a question I like to add to such organizations is, what about the release plan? And here you're usually met with, what do you mean? The deadline is on the roadmap. Yeah, that's not really a release plan. So I say a roadmap should contain desired outcome and desired impact. It should also contain a rough indication of the relevant market window. I think Gitti used the example of Lego doing a Christmas campaign or something like that. That is essentially a relevant, a meaningful deadline. A Christmas campaign in January is quite useless. And in the past 10 years, I've worked in one organization that had meaningful deadlines. All the other ones were just arbitrary dates made up for reasons no one could figure out. And on the other hand, a release plan should contain intended release date or intended release window. And it should always also highlight relevant dependencies and risks we have with those releases and those intended release dates. And here, a roadmap should not change very often. I say you should try to have a roadmap stable for at least a year. Like, don't change your roadmap more than a year. And absolutely not more often than every quarter. If you do, you're probably in a situation, either a very volatile industry or a very volatile market window or whatever, where a roadmap is completely useless to you. But a release plan, on the other hand, it can change as often as needed. I even say put the release plan in the hands of the teams, and let them set their own release cadence. It's on the large scale of things, it doesn't matter if it's weekly or monthly, or hopefully it's multiple times per day, but not all industries can do that. But leave it to the team. And here, essential when we're dealing with complex problems is that the more upfront detailed planning you do, the more you increase the likelihood of being wrong. So back to the quote in the beginning, it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And here, a crucial part of the tools and the artifacts that you use, they need to enable the collaboration we need to solve interdependent complex problems. We need to highlight dependencies we have between teams so we can effectively manage and deal with them. And this brings me to excuse number 3. Our product is simply too complex. We have too many dependencies. The cars we have on the road, they can't travel independently. And I had a manager that I worked with who essentially posed this question. So what if you're going on a family trip, but you have a very large family, so you need 2 cars? Should you wait for each other along the way, or how do you deal with the travel? Well, it depends. Also my favorite answer as a consultant. It depends on the nature of the dependency. Like, what type of family trip are we going on? let's say we're going camping, family camping trip. We have a travel day and we drive throughout the day and we arrive roughly around dinner time, and then we intend to have a barbecue, start pitching the tents, and start the vacation that way. If that's the case, it's better if the car that contains the barbecue and the food and perhaps most of the tents, it's better if that car arrived first. On the other hand, let's assume that one of these cars have a functioning radio. It even has modern Bluetooth technology to connect a phone and a backup physical cable to connect an external audio source, whereas the other car does not have that. If that's the case, it might be a good idea to coordinate and say, do you have a cable over so we can plug in any old phone with a 3.5 millimeter jack so we can listen to some music? Yeah, we have that. Cool. Let's stop at the next gas station, hand the cable over so we also can listen to some music. Perfect. Because if you're on a long drive, you might not keep up conversation all the time, and it might be good to just sit back, relax, listen to some music. Otherwise, that car might arrive at today's destination with a bit of a sour mood, affecting everyone, starting off the family trip poorly. So it might be a good idea to coordinate in that case. So as I said, it depends on the nature of the dependency. And in one organization I worked, one of the tools we used for this was simply a dependency board. Who here has heard of a dependency board before? Made famous by SAFe. I'm not going to talk about SAFe, don't worry. But the dependency board, visualize what you see you can manage. And in this organization, I don't exactly remember the size, but it was the engineering part was roughly 100 to 150 people. They were quite well on their journey to do quarterly plannings. The output of that quarterly planning was this big quarterly plan on a physical whiteboard. Now this was a 2-day event. It took a lot of energy from a lot of people. And usually the week after the quarterly planning was done, no one looked at the plan anymore because it had already changed. So the change we introduced was that we started using the dependency board as a sliding window. Meaning once you finished iteration or sprint number 1, you physically removed that from the board and shifted all the other ones one step to the left. And then you shifted in the first sprint or the first iteration in the next quarter. By simply adding that idea and that concept, this became I hate the word living document, but that's essentially what it became. It became an artifact that we actively worked with. And this became the go-to place for the product managers to do their weekly catch-up. They looked at the board, checked the status, what's going on, who needs help from what, and to the degree that the development teams themselves actively went there to update the status of what essentially was their release plan. Because their row on this board was essentially what they intended to release and roughly when. So it became a very dynamic thing that the whole organization started to actively work with. The added benefit that this had was that once the next quarterly planning came around, the first draft of the plan was already there. And before, the week, maybe even week and a half before this quarterly planning in these 2 days, it was impossible to get a hold of the product managers. Because they were all running around talking to stakeholders, trying to understand what the hell are we doing for the next 3 months? And once you pose that question in a hurry to the stakeholders, they, on the other end, do the exact same things. So the plan was not very sustainable, and it was, as you can understand. But what we effectively did was we took those week and a half of preparation work, and we just spread that out over the whole quarter instead. So we didn't spend less time. We probably spent more time actually planning or having crucial conversations, making important decisions. But it made the whole ordeal of the 2-day event of quarterly planning much more pleasant, and we can actually focus on the right conversations. Is this the right plan? So by now, I hope I've sparked some ideas and some curiosity and some thoughts in you. And crucially, if you're interested in trying, maybe not the whole approach, but one thing or two things, where do you start? You have to start where you are. And that essentially means that you need to take a step back and you need to understand the state of your road. What is currently on your road? You need to look at the individual vehicles that are there and you need to classify them. And once you start looking at them, you're likely to find bicycles, cars, buses, e-scooters, motorcycles, trucks. You will even find an elephant or two. And crucially, what do we do when we find the elephant? We get the elephant off the road. The other side of that coin is that it can actually be a decision that the elephant is so incredibly valuable to us that we need to allow the elephant to stay on the road. It can absolutely not get off the road. Yeah, that's fine. It's a perfectly fine decision to make. If that is so, you have to get all the other traffic off the road. Because cars and elephants on an asphalted highway, they don't mix very well. And remember, we allowed the elephant on the road to begin with the expectation and assumption that it was actually a roadworthy car that could travel neatly in one lane at 50 kilometers an hour. An elephant is not that. So, and furthermore, I published a book. All the drawings are my fantastic creations by hand. I published a small book on this about a year ago. I regret the title already, but Simplifying Complexity, Predictable Delivery in Software Development Organizations, subtitled The Roadmap. And once more, it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. So thank you very much for your attention. I have been Joakim von Prónay, and that's what I have to say on this topic. Do we have time for one question up here? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it might be me that missed a bit, but I quite don't understand how you get from the very good forecasts and then use these on a corporate planning level. Because I totally get how you could get from we can do 5 things in one sprint, 7 in another. That's an average 6. But then you will try to use that to plan about things that are these blocks or elephants.
Yeah, exactly.
How do we do that without rough estimating these idea blocks that are usually the things that are on your roadmap?
You use the same rough approach as you do on team level, where if your goal is to produce uniform pieces of work, you can have the same rough approach on all the work item levels, and knowing that they will absolutely not be the same size. But for a forecasting purpose on high level, what we're going to do next year, you can simply treat them as such, and you can look at your historical ability to actually finish those things. So if you have some sort of ticket tracking software, even on epic level, you can say, last quarter we finished 3 epics. And if you have roughly the same size, then you will roughly do 3 things next quarter as well. And this, I touch upon this a bit more in my book as well, with some more details and some more answers. Here I had very limited time. But essentially, I have been in organizations where we see last quarter we did 10 things. Why do we think we're going to do 20 things next quarter? What do you mean? It's all based on the team's estimates. Yeah, the last things were as well. Like, it's valid question, absolutely. Cool, I release you.